Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Tony Levitas. It's a great pleasure to be here. I feel a little bit like an imposter because I don't speak Ukrainian and I don't really feel myself an expert on matters Ukraine, though I have worked there over a number of years. I went off to write a PhD dissertation about 30 years ago to Poland, and the wall came down and one thing led to another, and like many bourgeois fellow travelers of the Union, moved from solidarity into the rebirth of local governments in Poland. And one thing led to another, and I became something of a fiscal plumber. So my sort of bread and butter for most of the last 30 years has been adjusting or thinking about the valves and pumps that bring money into and push money out of local governments, and particularly the intersection between local governments and education finance. For the last few years, I've been going in and out of Kiev on a Swedish-funded program to provide technical assistance to the ministries of regional development and finance on their decentralization process. And what I'm going to present here today is a very abbreviated version of an overly long report whose gory technical details I will try to spare you, though that is my bread and butter, and we can, get into those details, but I want to try and tell a broader story. So this is a picture of a sort of standard picture of the gross measure of decentralization of countries in Europe. The green bar is the share of the GDP in the public sector, consolidated revenues of the public sector. The orange bar is the share of the GDP in the hands of local governments or subnational governments, and they're ranked across the percentage of local government revenues as a share of total public revenues in the country as a whole. And that's typically the measure of decentralization, one of the gross measures of decentralization. So you can see that the most decentralized country in Europe is Denmark, high share of the GDP in the public sector and a very high share at the local government level. And then we can see across the bottom, we have Finland, Germany, Belgium, Sweden, Spain, Switzerland, and Denmark. These are the highest ones. But surprisingly, we have a very decentralized Ukraine. And this is a picture from 2016, but you could have this picture from any year after 1990, and the position of Ukraine would not change very much. Okay? So in strictly financial terms, the problem with decentralization, in quotes, in Ukraine has never been strictly financial. Before I go on, I'm going to make two other observations here. You will see that of the high performers on the decentralization scale, we have federations marked with an asterisk and Nordics, with Poland just under the EU average here. That signifies a very profound difference in what decentralization might mean. The Nordics, what we're really talking about is highly municipalized regimes, where the second tier of local government, the provincial or regional level, is very small, and all the action is at the municipal level. In the federations, most of the action is at the regional level. And municipalities are creatures of regional governments and typically don't perform very significant services. I'll also add that the killer function in these scales is really the first one, the killer app, is education. At the moment that you move education down to the subnational level, you're moving 3 to 7% of the GDP to the local level. The next ones are social service functions. How do I, okay, no, no. What's the, no, I think it's this. Normally it's this. And we're not that there. There we go. So in strictly fiscal terms, Ukraine has always been very decentralized, and its problem has never been really the financial one. Instead, three other issues have crowded out the discussion. The first is that despite the fact that in Ukraine, oblast, rayons, cities of oblast significance, and gromada are all referred to as local governments, the reality is at the oblast and rayon levels, it is not clear. What we have is, according to the Constitution, state-appointed oblast governors and rayon governors who also appoint the heads of key departments, combined with a democratically elected council. So these are neither fish nor fowl in some sense. Only at the city and the village or gromada level do we have both democratically elected councils and mayors, and in that sense can they be considered true local governments. The second problem is that throughout the history of the independence period, the central government, largely through this vertical chain of command operating through the oblast, but not only, has maintained expenditure norms. So on the one hand, local governments are given money and told that they're responsible for a sector. On the other hand, the national government maintains standards for how much they should pay to a hospital for a hospital bed, or to schools for school teachers, or that they can't close a school or can't close a facility on their own. And the third problem is, like many countries in post-communist Europe, when the wall came down and there was this movement to democracy, the idea was let 1,000 flowers bloom. So bring democracy as close to the people as possible. And as a result, in Ukraine, but not only, in Czech, Slovakia, Hungary as well, not Poland, importantly, not the Balkans, importantly, we got a very fragmented regime of local governments in the countryside. So in Ukraine, we have had 12,000 villages with an average size of 1,500, and they are simply too small to provide basic public services, and as a result, they become dependent on higher levels of government, in this case, mostly rayons, for their functioning. So together, these problems have made it extremely unclear in Ukraine who's really responsible for what, and in particular, in these two very important, fiscally heavy sectors of health and education. The unclear responsibilities in these sectors have intersected with a European-wide problem of demographic decline. So the population of Ukraine, leaving aside the occupation and the annexation of Ukraine, has declined radically, like it has all over Europe, and particularly in Eastern Europe, forcing what should have been an adjustment of school networks and hospital networks. But in a situation where nobody is really sure of who's really responsible for running the schools or paying for the schools, because we have these unclear expenditure norms and because we have unclear chains of double commands at these levels of government, everybody has assiduously avoided making any effort to adjust the size of the public sector to a population that is 15 or 20% less than when these networks were built. And as a result, Ukraine has one of the lowest teacher-pupil ratios in the world and one of the highest percentages of doctors and nurses per 100,000 patients, or hospital beds per 100,000 patients in Europe. I think this is the scary overhang in the background of this problem, and the problem that in some sense cannot be named. In other words, somebody at some point is going to have to do something to rationalize these networks, and this is the problem from hell for local government officials. There is nothing worse for a mayor than to have to close a school. No matter how justified that is for pedagogical reasons or for quality reasons, it is just extremely difficult everywhere in the world. Now, it's even worse when you have to think about doing that for both education and health. Okay. So after the Orange Revolution, plans were drawn up for Ukraine to move towards a Polish Nordic model of local government. What do I mean by that? As I said in the beginning, there are sort of two models of decentralized governance, one where the emphasis is on the regional level, the other is on the emphasis at the municipal level. The Polish model put almost all day-to-day public services at the municipal level and relegated the oblast and the powiat, the district and regional structures, relatively minimal roles. If you looked at the money in the Polish system, it's a triangle. 2/3 of the money is at the bottom, about 10–15% is at the middle, and another 10–15% is at the regional level. So the plans that emerged after the Orange Revolution were to make first-tier local governments the primary institution of local self-governance in Ukraine, and that called for strengthening the role of the cities. And in Ukraine, they're called cities of oblast significance. There are 178 of them, or 179 before the occupation. And to amalgamate these 10,000 gramada into about 1,000 units, okay? And the idea was that once you amalgamated them, you could give them reasonable service responsibilities and expect them to run things like a primary school on their own and release them from the tutelage of the rayons. At the same time, the idea was to reduce the role of the oblasts and to reduce and consolidate the number of rayons. And finally, to eliminate the expenditure controls and reform of the finance system. Now, most of my work is actually on this third point, and one of the problems now is that we're trying to reform the system through the finance system without the legal architecture behind it, because these things are blocked in Parliament. Oh, boy. Okay. So what happened is after with Maidan, these plans get revived. Poroshenko buys into decentralization as a defense against the federalization of the country. The old plans are taken out of the draw, but they can't pass the constitutional amendments to make oblasts and rayons democratically elected, and they're forced to do this through finance reforms. Now, what's interesting is that there is a real commitment towards decentralization in the sense that public finances are not re-centralized despite war and economic decline, which is rather remarkable, and the share of local government revenues goes up, so the government has done a lot. But the way the government has talked about this remains extremely problematic. So the government has said, we've given all this new money to local governments, and that shows that we're committed to this policy. In fact, what happened is they gave a lot of inflationary money to local governments, and because teachers' wages and public sector's wages were frozen in 2015 and 16, it felt like a lot of money for local governments, and in fact, investment rates went up. So the first problem with the government's discourse is it's all new money. But this is problematic because it really masks what's important, which is that there has been a structural shift in the power, the relative power of local governments since 2014. So the big losers have been the oblasts, whose revenues have declined 28%, and some of whose functions have been given to the cities of oblast significance. The rayons have stayed the same, but now, as I'll show the next slide, 48% of all rayon budgets, revenues, and expenditures are transfer payments to individuals. So the rayons are increasingly simply windows for making social welfare payments. And what we see here is the per capita expression of the system now, and you can see that oblasts are below the village level, or at the same, on a per capita basis, but that the amalgamated gramadas, which have been created on a voluntary basis, again, a big oversight, they couldn't pass legislation that would require the forced consolidation of gramada. So this has been done on a voluntary basis. To make it happen, the government has had to make serious side payments. That's the red column at the top of the AG, that those are investment grants to encourage consolidation. But what we can see here is that the revenues of the newly created consolidated gramada and the cities are beginning to look very similar. And if we move the yellow, which is the transfer payments, over to the gramada, structurally, they would have achieved creating first-tier local governments that look like they're capable of providing financial services. The voluntary process has led to a certain amount of self-sorting, which is important. So because they haven't been able to impose consolidation, what we're seeing is, to some extent, rural gramada associating with each other because they're afraid of being politically dominated by a town, and the towns trying to keep the rural gramada out because then they don't have to pay for services in the surrounding areas. Some of the details of how the tax system work actually encourage this. So what's the problem? The first problem is that at this point, we really shouldn't be talking about decentralization at all. They would be much better off talking about the municipalization of basic public services and the reconstitution of the Ukrainian state. The second problem is that they've been talking about it in terms of all this new money, which is a complete illusion and is about to come back and bite them in the behind because teachers' wages have been raised. And more importantly, the government has made a decision, which I personally think is correct, to move to a single-payer healthcare system. And the creation of a single-payer healthcare system will suck money out of local governments, put it into the central payment system, and they'll actually be taking money away. And that runs against the existing discourse. So the reform is on a collision course with the healthcare reform. And the voluntary amalgamation is, 20% of the job is done, but 80% remains to be done, and it's costing them a lot of money, so they're sort of caught midstream, and whether they can sustain sitting there fiscally for very long is an open question. I'll end there.
Thanks so much.